Okay, Shavua Tov, Boker Tov. Today we will speak about Rabbi Chayim Yair Bacharach. Chayim Yair Bacharach. Bacharach is a city in Germany, but neither Rabbi Chayim Yair or even his grandfather was not in the city of Bacharach. So it's a very long history of the family coming from Bacharach. His name given at birth was Chayim, was called Chayim. Then when he was sick, it doesn't tell us when it was, what age it was. It seems that it was when he was pretty young. And the name that was added was the name Yair. That's an interesting, no, not Afuch. It was called Chayim at birth. Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting because usually the way it works is that they add the name Chayim, which makes sense. If someone is sick, you want to add Chayim, to add life. But for him, he was called Chayim when he was born, and the name Yair, which is not a very frequent name. It's very interesting. So the name Yair was added later. Now, the story of Rabbi Yair Chayim Bacharach begins with the name of the book. That's the book. That's a new print, so they split it into 2 volumes. The old one, which is made of a very small writing, printing, so that was in 1 volume. Now, usually, I'm an Israeli. I speak with a Sephardic accent, so we say Chavos Yair. But here, you miss the whole point of the name of the book if you call it Chavos Yair. The name is Chavos Yair. Now, why is that important? Because our story begins not with Rabbi Yair Chayim Bacharach himself, but with his grandmother, whose name was Chava. Now, we understand in a minute that she was a woman that Rabbi Yair Bacharach wanted to make a name for. So he called his sefer Chavos Yair. In Ashkenazic accent, it's Chavos Yair, Yair of Chava. Right? So that's the way that he had gave her a name that would remain. Now, what was so special about this woman, Chava? So Chava, his grandmother, was herself the granddaughter of the great Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Liva Betzalel of Prague. We spoke about him a few weeks ago. And so that's a yichus by that's alone is a yichus by itself, which would explain to us why it would be important for her grandson to mention her. But that is only the beginning. He tells about her in the introduction to the Chavos Yair, to the Chavos Yair. So he explained in the introduction. I would read it from inside. I apologize for not printing this time enough for everyone. We have a problem with the printer, but you can listen. He writes beautifully. He says, "Mitzad למודה, שהיתה יחידה במינה בדורה בתורה." So she was one of the kind in her generation in Torah learning. Venahirna, he says, I remember as a small child, he speaks about his grandmother. As a small child, I remember, she had a Midrash Rabbah, he says, bli peirush. So she had a volume of a Midrash Rabbah with no commentary, obviously with no translation. ולמדה בה על פי השגתה ושכלה. She learned the Midrash Rabbah according to her own understanding, according to her own mind. ובמקומות רבים השיגה על הרב בעל המתנות כהונה פירושי הרבות. So in some place there was some commentary that was going around, but it seemed that she preferred learning without the commentary because she believed that her own understanding is better than the commentary of the Rav that wrote the explanation of the Midrash Rabbah. ופרשה באופן אחר. She would explain otherwise. באופן שכל השומע יבחון שהדין עמה. It says everyone that would listen to her would know that she's right and the commentary, the formal commentary, is wrong. So that was his grandmother. ואיזה דברים מהם כתבתי בכרכים בשמה. So he says in some of my books we'll speak about it, אם ירצה השם, as we go along. We have very little from the fruits of the writing of Rabbi Yair Bacharach. That is extremely unfortunate. Almost everything he says himself that we have about 2%. He said, 1% מן ה-50. So that is 2%. From 100%, 1% from 50 is like 2 from 100, right? That's right. That's right. Many times he quotes, that's the way that he writes. As many other rabbinic scholars, he likes to use and to reuse the language of the Torah and of the Tanakh and of Chazal. So he says, in some of my books, I did bring things from her name. We only have one thing very interesting for Hanukkah, and she gave a whole explanation why women should not do melacha, not only at the time when the candles are burning, which I don't know if it's a minhag to this day, but for many centuries it was the minhag. She thought that women should be exempt or even asur in doing melacha throughout all of Hanukkah, throughout all of the 8 days, which is an interesting and a beneficial halachic position. And she had a whole explanation why is that so.
Only women.
Only women, that is right. That is right, only women.
What's there was a heroine.
Yeah, that's right. That's Yehudit, but she had an halachic explanation, not an agadic explanation, an halachic explanation having to do with the candles burning in the Beit HaMikdash and in Beit HaKnesset. Mirza Hashem, on Chanukah, we would have time, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu would give us the koach, and we would remember that we should do that. Then maybe we'll speak about her explanation. I want to continue. And he says, she wrote Peirush on Machzorim, on Slichot, on Peirush Rashi, on the Chumash, on 24. 24 is the whole of the Tanakh. So she wrote Pirushim. We have, unfortunately, not almost, we have nothing from what she wrote, so we do not know. But it's amazing to read. בתרגומים, ספרים החיצוניים. So I'm not even sure what does he mean when he says that she learned ספרים החיצוניים. But he says she learned that as well. וכמה פעמים שנתחבטו בדבר גדולי הדור, there are a few times that the great rabbanim of the generation were debating some issue, ובאה היא והושיטה בקנה. So she had to feed them with a spoon. Right? הושיטה בקנה, explain to them what halacha should be. והייתה מופלגת בכתב, she had an excellent writing. ולשון צח ומצוחצח, her language was impeccable. וגם הפלגות חסידותיה והנהגותיה אי אפשר להעלות על הנייר. You cannot even write her excellence in midot and in practice. So that's wonderful. That's really amazing. It's very rare. He goes on because she got, unfortunately, her husband, being the grandfather of Rabbi Yair, died in a very young age, and she was widowed, and she refused to remarry, he says, out of respect for her husband, who was a great rabbi. So he said, no one is coming to the level of the rabbi that I was married to, so I cannot marry anyone. And he says that the Shlah HaKadosh, an extremely important rabbi, which I have charata for not giving a shiur about him as well. But we would never be able to pass through the 70th century if we would not skip a little. So the Shlah HaKadosh, before making Aliyah, offered her that he would marry her and they would make Aliyah together. Now the Shlah HaKadosh was a very important rabbi of the generation, and she refused. She said, I am almost, afraid to say that, but I am only quoting. You do not deserve. And he says, and again, Rabbi Yair Bacharach give us a testimony in the name of the Shlah Kadosh, that the Shlah said, it's because of my sins that I was not deserving to be married to such a holy person. Now, the end of the story is that the grandmother, because she was not remarried, she lived with the father of the Chavot Yair, meaning she lived with her son. That's how we got to know her so well. Through near the end of her life, she did want to make Aliyah without the Shlah HaKadosh, just her herself, and she began the journey. As you are obviously well aware, 7th century conditions of journey is not taking a plane and landing here 2 hours later and then complaining about the security. So unfortunately, she died on her journey in Turkey, in Sofia. She died in Sofia, and excuse me?
Bulgaria.
That's right. Back then, it's important. It's a very good. It's a very good note. That's right. Back then, it was part of the Turkish Empire, of the Ottoman Empire. But you're right. Sofia, of course, is nowadays Bulgaria. But he writes Turkey because it was Turkey in their days. It's a very good comment. Thank you. Okay, so that's how the name Chavos Yair. Now, a later Rav writes that he heard the rumor that the way that it's an interesting way to name a book, that you need to read it according to the Ashkenazic accent, and the name is in Yiddish. In Hebrew, you cannot say Yair of Chava.
I have to say something. It's only one vav. It's not supposed to be Chavot. It's Chavat Yair.
But then it's the Chava of Yair. He wants it to be Chavos Yair, the Yair of Chava. Okay, fine. Fine, but it's still very special. It's special. And he says that he had a dream. The name came to him in a dream when they were reading the Parsha of Matot, when they were reading the Parsha of Chavot Yair. So that's not, excuse me, that's in, it's Matot, yeah. Okay, so that's the name of the book. Now let's speak about the person a little. So all of that was about the grandmother. Now you understand that he comes from an extremely important rabbinic family, right? So he comes from, his grandmother is this Chava, his grandfather is the Maharal himself. And that's a family, a line of Rabbanim, very important Rabbanim and Darshanim. And he is also Mr. Yeke. What do I mean by that? Now we need a little to change our view. When we learn history or Torah, but it's rooted in history, we need to sometimes forget. We need to forget the last 150 years, because obviously German Jewry had gone through very significant difference, right? And excuse me, ma'avarim, changes, thank you, in the last 150 years. So forget about Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, forget about Reform, forget about Geiger Lehavdil, forget all of that. And go now to the 17th century. Because we speak about, he was born, Rabbi Yair Chayim Bacharach, at 1638. And back then, to be a Yeke means to be a scion, be a descendant of a galut, which saw itself as coming directly from Yerushalayim, from Eretz Israel, and keeping their minhagim very, so that's Yekim to this day, right? Keeping their minhagim, their tradition. We would see in a few minutes that even the question of what exact nigun should be in a certain holiday, in a certain chag. So what is the nigun of the barchu in Arvit of Pesach? It's different than that of Sukkot, and it's different than that of Shavuot. And just you there try to do a karlibach there. All right, so that everything is in a very exact order. And he is part of this tradition. It's very important to understand, because we would see as the shir would go along the importance that he gives to minhagim, and that's come directly from who he is. Now, obviously, this position would stand in contrast to what is beginning, very early beginnings in his day of the coming of the early modern age. Things begin to change. If you would like it or not, things begin to change. The time of the medieval is just over, and the Jews needs to begin to adapt to new times. And it's not always easy for people that see the purpose of their life sometimes to just carry on exactly as their fathers and their forefathers and their grandfathers did. And that's the opening, we may say, of speaking about the life of Rabbi Yair Chayim Bacharach. Now, as I said, he was born, and throughout all of his life, he was in Yekeland, right? So he was there, it would be Vermaisa, it would be Magenza, it would be Frankfurt on the Main, but all the time he would be in this area. His father was a great rabbi, and his father was crowned as the Rabbi of Vermaiza. So Vermaiza is an extremely ancient and important kehila. Just one thing we have to remember, although it is extremely important and ancient kehila, the numbers were very small. The numbers of the Jews were very small. Sometimes it would be only in these kehilot, which are very ancient, but it would be only 30 or 40 families, much smaller than this community, for example, much, much smaller. Now, they would have pride, and they would have their minhagim, and they would sometimes carry on. It can be friendly relationship between families, it can be the other way, for generations, because they have very long memory in Yekeland. But the whole thing is sometimes, as I said, 30 or 40 families, and that's also important to understand in the background of the story that we are going to tell. So, yes.
So when you have the shul,
Sorry.
so what happens is, I perceive that it is much bigger than you described.
So the keynote that you speak about speaks about 600 years before the period that you are speaking now, right? You speak about the Crusades.
Yes, what happened.
And we speak about 1640. What happened is the Crusades and a few other events that destroyed the infrastructure of Jewish life there. The Jews that remained were holding with their fingernails. It was not simple. For many places, Jews were expelled in Germany. There was no Germany. I think we spoke that a few times. I don't want to go into details. There was no Germany. There were many, many, many cities with a prince or a paritz in each one of them. And each paritz would decide if he wants his Jews or he wants to expel his Jews. Only in very few places, Jews remained throughout the whole of the period. Vermaiza is one of these places. But the community was very small and struggling, economically struggling, as we would see again in a few minutes. So he was born and he was taught by his father. In a later question that he would ask much later in his life, in the Chavos Yair, so there was life are always the same. So there was some guy, and he writes it in the tshuva in the book. There was some guy that was very offended by the rabbi not coming to the bar mitzvah of his child. And he writes, everyone came, no one remained at home, you're the only one missing. Now, I would only forgive you. That's how the guy writes to the Chavos Yair. It was written in the book. And he says, I would only forgive you if you'd write me a tshuva in your own hand about how to educate my son to Torah. So that was the question. And the rabbi sat and wrote him an answer. And he describes how he was taught. So he begins his answer by saying there is no way you'd be able to educate him adequately. Why? Because in order to educate someone, you need to have a good teacher who only aims for the sake of heaven, and that is something that is non-existent. That's how he begins his tshuva. Okay, so that's not very good, but I guess he describes the situation. And then he says, even if you'd find someone, he says it's not in existence. Even if you would find someone, you would still have a problem. Why? Because you would find someone to teach your own boy. But you cannot teach someone in a vacuum. As part of the process of education is to be in the company of other boys. And the other boys, their parents would want to send them to the best school, which may be, I think, dysfunctional, but they would go to the name, right, to the brand. So they would send to the best school, and then your child would remain alone. Even if you be the best teacher in the world, you won't be able to give him real education, real chinuch. So he begins with that. And then he says, so what I advise to you, send your son to the school, but teach him in the after hours. Supplement. Yes, exactly, supplement. Teach him in the after hours. What should you teach him? And then he goes into a whole detail, and he says, my father learned with me Mishnah every day. So he made sure that I would be lucid in my knowledge of Mishnah, and then I would have the foundations upon which I would be able to build the Talmud, the Gemara, the Poskim. So he made sure that while in school we were only given, a taste of Mishnah, a taste of Gemara, and it was not in a real order, he made sure that everything would be built in an orderly fashion. Now you can, those of you that participated in the shiur about the Maharal Mipראג, you can see how this education system is passing along in the family. That's very interesting. You can also see that everyone knew that the education in Ashkenaz in 17th century, in 18th century was broken. Almost every rabbi we spoke about in the last 2 months was having problems with the way that the cheder and the yeshivot worked, because they were not really aimed to teach someone, as I said, in orderly fashion. They tried to produce instant lamdanim. So jump immediately to the Gemara, teach him immediately Tosfot, even that he does not have the foundations in Tanakh or in Mishnah. And that's a problem that we deal with, we may say, sometimes to this day. Okay, so that's about his childhood. Later, when his father wanted to send him to a yeshiva, to a high yeshiva, then he sent him to Frankfurt on the Main, and there he learned by the big names of the day, and he was ordained as a rabbi in the age of 23. He was married and ordained as a rabbi at the age of 23. And then troubles began. And you know, it's very interesting. When the title I sent to you yesterday night was a Yekish Rabbi facing modernity, and that's really the topic of the shiur. But truth is that, as always, we deal with people, we deal with personalities, and it's not only this obscure Yekish Rabbi, impersonalized Yekish Rabbi dealing with impersonalized modernity. In the end, it's real people with real problems and real challenges, and their personalities shine through the way they deal with the difficulties they face. And truth is, I changed the title of the shiur, of the lecture, because after I read through his הקדמות, his introductions, and other things that he wrote and were written about him, and he begins the introduction to this book that he wrote 2 years before his death. So I'm jumping here from the beginning of his life to the day that he reviews them. And the way that he begins the introduction, I will just read you the first sentence. Anochi haroe ve'eino nir'eh. I am the man that sees but was not seen. רק נדחה מפני השעה. I was always rejected because of the time, because of the hour. I was never able to, I would say, he was never able to time himself. You know, everything is about timing. And somewhat was always off. It was a great gaon we'll speak about, but something was always off. And he says, אשר הגיעו אליי ימי הרעה והיה רק זוועה. So that's how, now that's 2 years before his death, that's how he describes. That's very sad to hear. To me, it reminds me of Yaakov Avinu standing in front of Paro, and Paro asked him, how old are you? Which is a simple enough question, but Yaakov doesn't give him a number. He says to him, you know, my life were miserable, and they were shorter and bitter than my forefathers. That's how Yaakov says to Paro, and Yaakov stands there, and you know, after Yosef was missing for 22 years, and Yaakov himself was not able to be with his parents because he had to run away to Lavan for 22 years, and he reviews his life. That was 17 years before his death, and he says, my life was short and bitter. That's so sad. Now later, Yaakov had 17 excellent years in Mitzrayim. But this book was written only 2 or 3 years before the death of the Chavos Yair. We'll speak about that. So he was ordained as a rabbi, and then in the year of 1666, he became a rabbi in Koblenz, which is another small and ancient community in Germany. We do not know exactly what did happen there. but I think I already mentioned that back then the system was that you were chosen as a rabbi and you would serve for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, then it would be re-elections. And if you'd be re-elected, it would be more or less for life. So you needed to pass through the pilot. And he went there to Koblenz in 1666, and he didn't pass the pilot. So after 3 years, he says, I was there for 3 years and a few days because they voted him out. Now, he says, he was a noble neshama. So he says, I would not write. In his הקדמת, he says, I was voted out. I am not going to write who is to be blamed because I want to put it behind me. So we just do not know. We have no information. We can only guess. I want to make an educated guess. Maybe it's not educated, a wide guess. The year 1666 is a very important year in Jewish history. We spoke about it already. It's the year of Shabtai Tzvi. It's the year of Shabtai Tzvi. Nothing, no mention of Shabtai Tzvi is made out of the whole of the Sefer of Chavos Yair. Now, that makes no sense. For anyone living, it's like living through the 40s in the 20th century and writing halacha and not mentioning in any way that there was a Shoah and then there was the foundation of the state. You can oppose, you can be in, you can be against, you cannot ignore. That we speak about a phenomenon that hundreds of thousands of Jews, maybe more, were swayed by in obviously in the Ottoman Empire, but also in Poland. The Taz was involved in that. The others were involved in that. It's not something you can ignore. So my wild guess is that it has to do with Shabtai Tzvi. Now, I cannot know if many Rabbanim, great Rabbanim, were mistaken in the first few months. And after it was revealed that Shabtai Tzvi was not the real Mashiach, then it was very embarrassing. And some of them lost their positions. Some of them, because they opposed and then were proved right, that was made the other party angry. And no one wants to live with someone that was proved right and you were proved wrong. That's just human nature. So my wild guess that it has to do with that, but it's a completely wild guess. I mean, the fact that he doesn't write anything about it and the fact that it's happened in the same year. So to me, it seems as it's a possibility, but you know, it may be also that it just picked up a fight with the head of the Kahal. Everything can happen. Yeah.
The way you describe his personality, it could have been that everything you say is correct. However, the reason maybe they didn't like was because it's in the Shonara, you know, and so therefore he just wants to ignore that.
For sure. Everything, as I said, everything is possible. I'm drawn to the ear. That's all. I cannot prove anything. Okay. So he was fired, basically, in 1669, after 3 years, and then he goes back to Vermaisa, to his father. His father is the rabbi of Vermaisa. In the same summer, his father passes away. And he writes in his הקדמת, now I see it was the hand of God that I would be fired in Koblenz, so I would be able to stand next to my father when he passes away. Now, his father asked the Kehila in his last will, in his Tzava'a, he asked the Kehila to appoint Rabbi Yair Chayim in his place. And, you know, you would expect that his father was an esteemed rabbi, and Rabbi Chaim Yair, or Yair Chaim, was already very much known. He was already sent questions from all over Europe. We have questions from before 1669. So you can imagine that you would be appointed, no problem. Many problems. So for a few months, it seems that it would work. We had a very interesting testimony. There was a guy, a shamash, in the shul of Vermaisa, who wrote a memory book, a gabbai book of minhagim, the minhagim of Vermaisa. As I said, they were very keen on their minhagim. And he wrote a book. And in his book, he is dealing with the very important question of, can someone who is an avel go to the amud in the tefillot of Yamim Noraim? Now, again, for someone that is from the outside, that seems to be a very non-important detail. But if you are a shul goer, you know that that's more important than almost any other halachic question that you can have. So can an Avel, especially if you have a Chazaka of 2,000 years or something, go to the Amud if he's an Avel in the first year on one of his parents? And Rabbi, and this Yosef, the Gabbai, the Shamash of the Shul, says that we had this case because the great rabbi, the father of the Chavot Yair, was Niftar in the summer, as I said. And in the Chagim, his son was an Avel. But his son did go to the Amud, and he was the Chazan for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. When we asked him to do Tfilat HaGeshem, he refused. He said that is improper for an Avel to do. But then Rabbi Yosef adds, it may be that what was correct for the Chavot Yair was not necessarily correct for other Chazanim. Why? He says the Chavot Yair had three very important features. One was that he was very much knowledgeable, baki, in the kavanot, in how to aim, how to direct yourself in the tefillah. And that is one reason why he was maybe necessary, even that he was an Avel. Second, he had a great voice. And third, he knew the nusach of Vermaisa, which again, for them, that was, as I said earlier, for them, that was the deal breaker. That was a take it or leave it. I mean, you cannot import a chazan from outside because it doesn't know the nigunim. You must have, I don't speak about the words. That's, if you do that, then you'd be stoned. If you are, say, Yatzmach Purkune, right, you'd be stoned. But we speak only about the nigunim, but it's very important. You would say exactly the same nigun that we are saying here for the last, as I said, we came from Yerushalayim, so for the last 1,600 years in their time. So it seems that he was accepted by the community. However, again, for a reason that he does not detail in his akdama, because he is a noble neshama, so he doesn't write. And for some reason, the Keila said, you are not eligible. Why you're not eligible? So he said, they told me that because I am a house owner, it's a balabait, but we don't here mean a balabait in the modern sense. But in the modern sense, when they say in the yeshivot, someone is a balabait, they mean that he doesn't know how to learn. But back then, a balabait means that he was part of the community. He was a member, a standing member of the community. And the rabbi must be someone who is not a standing member. That's the reason they gave him. It seems from him, from what he writes, that it was just an excuse. And instead, they brought a rabbi, his name was Rabbi Aharon Teomim. Now, Rabbi Aharon Teomim was a rabbi. Everyone knew that he is not of the same league even as the Chavot Yair. It was clear to everyone. Now, I would just read to you what is written in the Encyclopedica Judaica, and I thought it's interesting to read. So he says, Bacharach was undoubtedly right in considering himself the superior of Teomim, who was a now I would read what they write. Fine, it's not me. It's Louis Ginsburg, who was Teomim, who was a representative of the school of the most degenerate casuistry. So I thought that's a good insult. Wow. While Bacharach was a systematic and true student of rabbinical literature and not altogether devoid of secular knowledge. So that's wow. I thought it's an interesting remark. It's an interesting sentence. But even if you do not hold Rabbi Teomim as a degenerate, etc., again, he was a shul rabbi. He wrote a perush on the Haggadah. I mean, fine, nice. But you cannot compare it to someone who was a gaon in halacha, who was writing tshuvot all over Europe. So I am not sure, and we do not know, what was the reason why the simple choice of choosing the son of your recent rabbi, who is also the son of your city, so he knows all of the minhagim and everything that there is to know, and choosing someone else. What was interesting is that Rabbi Yair Bacharach remained in Vermais. We would think that he would leave and look for another rabbinic post. He did not. He stayed there. Now, just imagine having a shul with, as I said, 30 families, 40, maybe 40, but it was less. And one of them is the Gadol Ador. So I just imagine, let's say I'm a third league rabbi, fine. So I stand up in the pulpit, and there would be, I don't know, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach sitting here in the chairs. So how exactly am I supposed to be a rabbi like that? I mean, who would ask me questions? But that was how they lived for 20 years.
Maybe it was, they knew that they came together to be in a, no, maybe he refused to be the rabbi because, I don't know, issues, but he was the big rabbi and someone else, just ran the community.
Came to bar mitzvot. It may be what happened. The relationship between them was not simple. It was very tense. It was very, very tense. We know that there are two manuscripts in which the Chavot Yair wrote very sharp criticism of things that were said or written by Rabbi Aaron Teomim, but both were put in Gniza. He decided not to publish them. So he wrote them. We found them in the Gniza, but he did not publish them. So they were not published up to the 19th century. So obviously it was very tense. It was not simple, but again, he was of such a stature that he did not, if he would have wanted, he could have, write a critique after every drasha of Leil Shabbat and completely destroy Rav Teomim. He decided not to do so. And again, that's, I think, a testimony to the personality and to his midot. So now he stays in the community. It's not clear what he made his parnasa of. It seems that he was teaching a little. He was also acting as a dayan. So when someone would have some type of a quarrel of needed litigation, so he would come to Rabbi Yair Bacharach and both parties would pay, and he would issue a psak, a halacha. So it seems that that was what he was living off. Maybe we know that he had a house, so maybe he had also something to rent out and make some money. We are not sure. We do not know how exactly he lived, but he did. And then he said, okay, so I am without a day job. What would I do? And he decided to embark on a great project. He said, the Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim is a very difficult book, and it is not adapted to our minhagim here in Ashkenaz. The Rema adapted it to Poland. But here in Ashkenaz, there is still work to do. So I would write a Peirush on Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. And he worked on that for more than 10 years until he completed the task. Now, but then he said, before I print that, I want to print something for my father, because it is irrespectful to print my own sefer before I print my father's sefer, which remained in manuscript. So he published his father's manuscript. That took another few years. And then when he came to print his own book, upon which he worked for more than 10 years, no, not yet, came to the market, the Shulchan Aruch, the edition that we call Maginei Eretz. This is the edition with the commentary of both the Orach Chaim, with both the Taz, about whom we spoke, this Rabbi David Segal, and another great rabbi that we didn't speak about, which is the Magen Avraham, Rabbi Avraham Bumbiner. Now, after they explained and commented and made their explanations on the Shulchan Aruch, he writes himself in the Akdama. He says, truth is, 2/3 of my work was redundant, was unnecessary anymore. Now, he had some comments to make on them, but said, I need to redo my whole thing because there is no point anymore in publishing my original work. I need now to write it as a comment on the work of these two great rabbis who beat him to the prize, but only because he wanted to print his father's book first. So it's not always, I guess, pay to be a gentleman. And again, that's part of what I read earlier from him, that he always feels that he was rejected because of time. Something in the timing was off. So he was fired from Koblenz, and then he came, and for some reason he couldn't become the rabbi of Vermais. And then when he wrote this great project that he worked about, then he discovered that it was done by someone else just because he worked also on the work of his father. By the way, in 1982, they found the manuscript of this book that he didn't publish, and they did publish it. It was published by Machon Yerushalayim, so 40 years ago, and it's called Makor Chayim. The name is Makor Chayim. You can buy it, but the truth is that yes, most of the work was done by the Taz and the Magen Avraham. That's just what happened. Okay, and then he said, you know, okay, I'm sitting here in Vermais, so I would, and he's always answering shailot that come from all over Europe. I would write a sponsor. And truth is that he says that he wrote more than 50 volumes, but he had no money to print them and to publish them. He wrote a mafteach, an index to these volumes. That's the only thing that survived for most of these volumes. I mean, the manuscripts were lost, but we have the index. So we know the heikef, the scope, thank you, the scope of the subjects that he was dealing with, but most of the writings we just do not possess. He was dealing with topics of thought, of Jewish philosophy, of astronomy, of handasa, calculations, geometry. His hand was in everything. Kabbalah, his hand was in everything. But more or less, we have another book, a part of the Chavos Yair, but more or less, this is all that is left from his great work, because he had only the money to print the tshuvot that were printed here. The suffering does not conclude here. After 20 years, there was what we call the 9 Years' War. You do not have to remember the 9 Years' War, but it was a war between France and basically the whole world. So we're speaking about 6089, and the French conquer parts of Germany, including Vermais. And they decide that as a part of a scorched earth strategy, they would burn down all the cities that they conquer. Now, that was not an anti-Semitic specifically step, but as always, the Jews suffered when there were wars. And they burned down Vermais, just burned the city down. And the Jews dispersed and just flew everywhere, including Rabbi Yair Bacharach, Rabbi Yair Chayim Bacharach. Now, the Rav of the city, Rav Teomim, decided that because the community was destroyed, there was no more community of Vermais. So he took a position in Krakow. Unfortunately for him, he was in his journey to Krakow, he was captured by robbers, by thieves, who tortured him to death. And that was his end. And again, I hope that what I said earlier is not in any way, I mean, he was a good man, for sure. He was a good rabbi, he was a good man. He was just not in the stature of the Chavos Yair. That's all. And he has his own, he was shlemaz in his own way. It was very difficult to be a Jew in Europe in these times and be a Baal Mazal. Very, very rare, because the bad Mazal was hunting you everywhere in the figure of people. So Rabbi Yair Bacharach, on the other hand, he did not abandon the sheep. He was encouraging the Jews of Vermais, who were now in exile. He was encouraging them to keep the minhagim of Vermais. He said, one day we will return. Now, again, maybe we in the 21st century, we would say, instead of speaking about returning to Vermais, if you're just expelled from Vermais, maybe begin to advance towards Eretz Israel. But obviously that was not in their mind back then. We cannot judge them according to our standards. So he was saying to them, one day we'll return. We love Vermais. I am part of you, I am part of the community, and we will return to Vermais. So keep them in Hagim. He has a whole tshuva in one of these volumes about a kehila that was exiled, needs to retain its minhagim. Although usually if a Jew leaves his community and go to another community, he needs to adapt the minhagim of the new community. But here he says, because it's the whole community that was uprooted, we need to return our minhagim. Now, this tshuva became very important when Jews immigrated in mass, in Aliyah, to Eretz Israel. Because if we are only individuals coming to Eretz Israel, we need to accept all the minhagim of Eretz Israel. By the way, that's what Rabbi also thought that we should do. We should abandon the Ashkenazic minhagim, and because the minhagim in Eretz Israel were the Sephardic minhagim, the Shulchan Aruch lived in Eretz Israel, we all need to adopt the minhagim of the Shulchan Aruch. But we did not accept this opinion because we rely, among others, we relied on the Chavot Yair, saying that if the whole community is moving, it keeps its minhagim. So that's a very important tshuva to the future. And so he wrote the tshuva and he was encouraging them. And as he wrote, 10 years later, they were allowed to come back to Vermaisa, and then they made him to the Rabbi, because Rav Teomim left to Krakow and happened what did happen. And now it's always the question, is that a sign of respect when they appoint you under such considerations, or does that mean that you are second or third when there is no other choice and then they pick you? Be it as it may, he was not very old, he was 60 something. To us it would be young, very young. Then it was already beginning to become old, but his health was very much damaged by all the moving arounds and by the exile, and I think also he writes that, by all of the disappointments he had in life. And I would like to read to you a few lines how he describes his own situation when he was appointed as a rabbi in 1699. So that would make him just 61. 60 is very young. 61, but listen to his health situation. He writes it. He says, לסיבות וטרדות, פחד, דרך ועוון, because of my difficulties and because of the road I had to take and because of my own sins, עזבני כוחי, my strength left me, והזקנה קפצה עליי, so old age jumped on me. עם ביטול חוש הנכבד אשר ירד למטה השמיעוני ואור עיניי. So he says, I became deaf. I cannot hear anymore, or I can hardly hear, and I can hardly see. He lost his sight. So he became almost completely deaf and blind. I don't want to be cynical, but you can imagine the community say, now you can be the rabbi. A rabbi that cannot see and cannot hear, that's something that you can live with. So, הזקנה קפצה עליי, עם ביטול חוש הנכבד אשר ירד למטה, השמיעוני, ואור עיניי החוש, והשכל גם הם, I am not as acute, I am not as sharp as I used to be. ואפילו 4 אמות של הלכה והליכה, אני צריך סעד ושמיכה. He says, I cannot even move 4 אמות without someone helping me, and I cannot in halacha, I cannot write tshuva. I can read to someone and he would write, but I cannot write anymore myself because he lost his sight. וצל הכסף נעה, וצל החוכמה מטה, ומזונותיי מרורים. I do not taste anymore. So he lost that's also something that happens. So he lost his taste. כזית לשמיר ולשייט, ואני כלוא בבית. I am locked up in my house. He cannot go out anymore because of his difficulties. disabilities, באופן שאין בכוחי לבור וללבן ולזקק ולסדר ספרי הנ"ל. He says, I am not able to write. Now, again, he published this book more or less in that time, and he says, I cannot really make it as I wanted. I wanted all the answers to be clarified, and there is no order in the Sefer. There is no order, just the questions one upon the other. I think he just took out his manuscript and sent them to print because he was not able anymore to supervise the printing. So again, he came to print his book too late. כי יודעים כל יודעי ומכיריי, אשר הייתי כגבר אין איל, וכאיש אשר לא יצלח לכל. So again, so sad. He says, everyone that knows me know that I didn't succeed in everything I tried to do. ובצולמנה נפיק ואיל בדעה קלישתא, so he says, I'm hardly can go, hardly can come, דעה קלישתא, my mind is leaving me, לא זכה ולא ציל, ודעתי לא נתיישבה כי לא מצאה מנוח, וכמדומה שאין בקודקודי מוח. So he says, I cannot find rest to sit and think as I should, and I feel as there is no brain in my head. So, okay, it goes on and on. I think that's enough of that. And then he says, so if that is so, why do I print the book now? So, you know, many authors, if they come to a stage that they cannot write themselves, so they give their children, and their children would order the book, just as he did to his own father. Right? He printed the Tshuvot of his own father. But he says, in my sins, I cannot even wait for that. Why is that? כי לרוב מחברי ספרים אשר לא זכו בימיהם להוציא ספריהם, הנה בניהם וצאצאיהם, אשר גם כן עליהם אור תורה נגע עליהם, ומילאו מקום אבותיהם, מילאו ידיהם לפרסם דבריהם ולהוציא לאור תעלומותיהם. He says most of the authors, even if they cannot themselves print the books, so their children are as them, ממלא מקום אבותיו. They feel their place, they are great in Torah as their fathers, maybe even more, and ברוך השם, and they can print the sefer. וכאשר בעוונותיי הרבים, גם בזאת חסרוני, he says in my sins, that's another one of my deficiencies, thank you. כי אין לי בן ממלא מקומי. I do not have a son that would fill my place. Now, you'd maybe hope that he just does not have a son, but he had two sons. But he says they are him, and that is so sad to write it in the introduction to your sefer. It says they are unable to publish a Torah book. And he says, חוששני, פן אם יבואו כתבי הקודש לידיהם, לא יהיו חביבים בעיניהם. So if the manuscripts would come to them, they would not treat them in the right way. וחלילה יהיו לבוז, and then they would just be stolen by other people, so they would just spread away. לכל הבא להתלבש בטלית של אחר. So people would just steal them in order to take the good votim out of them, right? To take the good ideas, and people would just clothe themselves with clothes that does not belong to them, and my name would be forgotten. ויהיו מפוזרים בארצות כאבני גיר מנופצות. לכן הוצאתי והצלתי ולקחתי, these are of course that's built on the words of הקדוש ברוך הוא משה רבינו, the 4 לשונות של גאולה. הוצאתי והצלתי ולקחתי 1% מן ה-50. As I said, only 2%. That is what I'm able to do now, and I cannot rely on my children to do any more work. And he was right. I mean, as I said, we lost all the other manuscripts. וכתבים הקדושים. So that's in 1699, and in 1701 he is niftar. He passes away. It was in Gimel Tevet. It was in the middle of Hanukkah. And no, excuse me. No, so it should be Bet Tevet, I think. Yeah, so I think it was Bet. It was supposed to be in Hanukkah, if I remember correctly. It was the 1st of January of 1702, and then he passed away. Now I looked a little. I thought, what happened to his children? It was so bad. I couldn't find anything. I think that maybe there were just no rabbis. There were not rabbis. But for him, coming from the family that he came from, that was a very bitter disappointment. That was if your father and your grandfather and your grandgrandfather and 6th generation were not just rabbis, but great men, then having no son to fill your place, as he calls it, that was I guess that for him that was the last straw, we may say. However, we shouldn't end with such a downturn spirit. His sefarim became foundational in psikat halacha. Or you cannot write a tshuva on something that he wrote about without relating to him. Some of his tshuvot are very, very important. I already mentioned the tshuva about minhag, that is very important. Another tshuva that he has is about kaddish to a girl. is one of the first sources, maybe the first, to relate to this question. Now, again, that was part of the German rabbi meets modernity. And he is torn. Why? Because on one hand, you remember the whole Sefer is named after Chava. So he believes that women should get their place and to be mentioned. On the other hand, he's Mr. Minhag. He's coming from, you cannot do something that was not just, it cannot be done. It's a wall, you cannot pass through it. So he is really torn, and he suggests maybe she should do it in the home, so not in the shul, it would not be against the minhag. So that's a suggestion, and then he rejects that as well. He says no, because if we would allow that, people would begin to do with minhagim as they please. And that is the worst thing, right? that someone like him can imagine. People doing in minhagim as they please. So that's, I mean, what the next thing would be? They would change the tune to the Baruch of Pesach. So that's out of the window. And he says not only that it is not allowed, you should, if you are the parnas, if you are the gabbai of the Rab, you should limchot, right? You should rebuke if someone is trying to arrange a private minyan in his home in order protest against such a kadi. So, but the tshuva, I mean, if we do not focus only on the bottom line, but through the process that he's going through, you can see how he's trying to react to these new questions. Another interesting question he has: can a rabbi be a klezmer in weddings? So, is that considered a bizayon, a disrespect? Or is that something that it's a mitzvah, it's beautiful, so he's both a Rav and a menagen? It's a very interesting question. And he's debating back and forth. And in the end, he says, yes, it's a mitzvah, and it's excellent, it's beautiful. And he has a few re'ayot from the Gemara. He says that's, go and be a, he calls it, by the way, a badchan. Go and be a badchan. But a badchan is not necessarily a stand-up guy. Back then, the klezmers, the people that would sing and play, were called badchanim. So it's a great mitzvah, and you can do that. He has a tshuva. I'm just in order, as I said. I want to finish with Torah of his, and not only with the aroe ve'eino nireh, because he is nireh. What we are doing now is to make him from transparent, as he says, I'm eino nireh. No one sees me, so we do see him. We do mention it, just a second. So another few tshuvot, very interesting. One tshuva is about Kabbalah. What about learning Kabbalah? And he's doing a very interesting move with that, because on the one hand he says, yeah, Kabbalah, that's the spirit, that's the soul of the Torah. It's so important, but it's so important that really no one can really teach it. So in the end, after putting the Kabbalah in a very high place, what he really says is that no one should learn it. So that's it's an interesting move again of a rabbi who is very much holding to minhagim. So in Ashkenaz, there's no real Kabbalah built then. So he doesn't want people to begin to learn Kabbalah. On the other hand, meaning that's it became already part of Jewish tradition. So what do we do with that? So the answer is we put it so high up that it's for the great rabbis. It's for the great rabbis. Another question that he's dealing with. That's something very sensitive, maybe, but would end with that. But it's again a very interesting question, which also reflects, I think, on the times that he was living through. And as we said, the economic status of the Jews were extremely poor. So we need to understand it as a background to the following question. The question was: there was a very poor guy in Vermais, and his only way of making any living was by business that he was doing with some goy that lived next to him, and the goy would deal with him with the skins of dead animals or something in that. Okay, fine. Now this Ani, this poor guy, this poor Jew, had he says a very beautiful daughter that was not married yet, and she was helping her father in the business, as was many times was very much common back in these days. Women were very much part of the business world. For sure in Ashkenaz. And so he would send the girl to the non-Jew, to the goy, to make the business. And the mother would accompany her, so she would not be there alone. After a few times it happened, it came to be known to the Jew that the non-Jew is harassing, we would say today, but in a very intimidating way, the daughter. Now, unfortunately, that was very common. Jews did not really enjoy legal defense. I mean, women back then in general did not really enjoy legal defense. But usually, if you do such a thing to a goy, then the father would come and murder you. And that was the defense. But a Jew would not, it was not possible. So the Jew decided that he would stop sending the daughter to do the business. He would come himself to do the business with the non-Jew. Non-Jew saw that. And he said to the poor man, I am only willing to deal with your daughter. I'm not dealing with you. And that was a real question. What to do now? What to do now? And this poor guy came to Rabbi, to the Chavos Yair, and asked him, what should they do? And Chavos Yair writes, some rabbis, some guys in the community told this man that he should better die of hunger and not send his daughter to deal with the non-Jew. And maybe for many of us, that would be our gut reaction. But the Chavos Yair deals with that. And he says, no, that is wrong. That is wrong. As long as there is no complete act, we may say, and as long as it is forced upon us, obviously there is no Avera here from her side. Avera is only from the side of the non-Jew. And because it is needed, because there is no other way of parnasa. So he says, if the community is able, then what should be done is that the ani should be supported by the community. They should either find him another work or just support him from the tzedakah. But if the community is not able to do so, and remember, the community was in very terrible shape. And maybe they were just not able to finance the whole family of the poor man. So he is allowed, if the need arises, he is allowed to send his daughter to deal with the non-Jew, and came what would pass. So I said that I would finish with a happy thing. I guess that it didn't work. But again, all of these questions are dealt later extensively. As you can imagine, some disagreed, some agreed, but they are dealt extensively and are used as a stepping stones for later expansions and chidushim of halacha and of Torah. And by that we may say that the fear of the Chavos Yair that would be forgotten and would be ein onire did not transpire, and as a matter of fact is very much seen by us, by all of us here. 300 years later, we sit here and we speak about him and about his Torah. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we should meet next week to discuss another one of our great sages. Thank you very much.
Thank you.